Whenever I think about landscape painting, more than anything else, I think about the land itself, how I'm connected to it. It's one of the reasons I take all of my own photos. If I look at a photo online, it can be the most amazing, breathtaking scene, but it's not mine. I haven't walked there or lived there. I haven't observed how its light changes as the sun sets. So, unless you have a personal connection to what you're painting, you might miss something essential, some key element that will color your understanding of the work, leaving you with just the surface, just pretty pictures of clouds, trees, and rivers. One of my favorite places in Bend is here, along the Deschutes River, which winds its way through much of the west side of town. The Old Mill District, which you can see across the river there, is now a tourist destination with restaurants, shops, and a theater, but it wasn't always like this. Like much of the rest of the state, Central Oregon's roots are in logging. 100 years ago, Bend was a thriving logging town as companies floated their logs down the Deschutes to huge sawmills like this one. By the time I moved here, almost 25 years ago now, the old mill looked like this. The sawmills had long been abandoned, driven out of business by depleted forests and spotted owls. I remember exploring these old buildings in the late 1990s, taking photos of them to use as textures in a video game I was working on. Remember those old warped brick textures in the very first Syphon Filter? Yeah, the old mill is where they came from. So I developed a deep connection to this place, the old mill, as I watched it change and evolve over the years. The one thing that never changes is the river itself. A series of small dams upriver create these large areas where the river flattens out, creating essentially large ponds. This spot in particular is one of my favorites. As the sun sets, you can watch as the old mill begins to light up. There's something magical about the way the reflections of all these bright orange lights scatter and glitter across the river's flat surface. This, I decide, is going to be my next painting for this series. I'm going to call it Old Mill Lights. In episode 1, Stormy Skies Over Bend, I talked about my painting process and technique, how I start with a photo, like this one, which I then transfer to the Masonite, creating this incomprehensible mess of squiggly lines, which I use as a guide to the underpainting, about how I'm not concerned with detail so much as feeling and capturing the broad strokes of light and shadow. This painting more than most, because, well, it's all about these old mill lights, so it's important that I get these values correct from the start. Once the surface is completely dry, I'm ready to start painting. Again, I use a very simple palette: chrome yellow, cadmium yellow medium, and cadmium red light for the lights, then a range of blues for the sky and water: phthalo, manganese, and cobalt. A little Portland gray, then my standbys: Payne's gray, titanium white, and burnt umber. I also use my usual assortment of new and old brushes, ranging from double aught to number 2, and my custom mixing medium, as well as odorless turpentine for thinning paint and cleaning brushes. As you can see, I start out with very tiny amounts of each color. It's a small painting, and I'm not going to need thick coats of paint. I decided to start with the sky, which I block in using broad strokes. I've sped up all these shots for this video, but the process goes pretty quickly. All told, the sky took about 15 minutes to paint. I'm not going to put too much work into it at this stage, just a base layer of color, because I know I'm going to come back to it later. For the water, I start at the bottom, and like I did with the sky, paint in the base color using broad strokes. Note that I'm ignoring all the detail down here because I know I'll have to come back and add those thick bunches of reeds after the paint is dried. Next, using mostly Payne's gray, I start painting in the dark reflections, working my way across the painting from right to left, adding shadows along the riverbank as I go. It's at this point that I make an executive decision. You can tell by looking at my underpainting that I had originally intended to paint in all the lights and the reflections using a wet-in-wet technique, where I would add those bright yellows and oranges into the scene while everything in the background was still wet. But now I'm thinking, man, that was a bad idea. It's going to be really hard to keep the colors clean, to not have the yellow reflections turn green as I blend them into the darker blues around them. For a different type of painting, something more abstract, green might be just fine, but not for this painting. I want to capture the orange glow of these lights just like I saw them. So all that work I did in the underpainting, gone. I paint right over it, knowing I'll come in and add the light reflections once the paint is dried. This is a hard lesson learned. The underpainting would have gone so much faster if I had thought about this at the start. But at least I'm saving a ton of effort now. Blending the water surface with all these dark reflections is so much easier without mixing in all those yellows and oranges. Some artists say they prefer watercolors to oils because they get more spontaneous effects, which is probably true. What I like about oils, though, is how flexible they are. You can make mistakes, sometimes huge mistakes, and paint right over them. Or you can change your mind in the middle of a painting and it's okay. As long as you're in the moment and thinking about your process as you go, it's awfully hard to mess up. Next, I use a lighter blue to enhance all of these ripples and wakes, helping to break up the river surface. And then I call it good. It's going to have to dry completely before I can come in and add the light reflections and the reeds at the bottom. I've mentioned before that when I'm painting, I like to suggest detail without actually painting it. Pilot Butte, for example, a fairly well-known landmark here in Bend, is easy to paint because I only have to suggest its rough surface of lava rock, grass, and sage, dotted here and there like it is with small juniper trees. Same thing with these trees in the background. I use one of my worn double-out brushes to achieve the indistinct edges that suggest lots of small branches. Then I start on all the foliage growing along the riverbanks. Notice how little green I'm using here, just the smallest amount, with lots of Payne's gray for the shadow areas. Again, you don't want a ton of detail, but just to suggest these clumps of grass, reeds, and sage. I keep the colors and values subdued here because all of this is background, really, for the lights that I'll paint in later. Like the bright reflections in the water, I've made the executive decision that I'm not going to paint these wet in wet. So all these lights in the underpainting, gone. It will be much, much easier to come and paint them in later once the background is dry. While I tend to ignore most small details, I will pick one or more elements to spend more time on. This tree on the right side of the riverbank will help provide a better sense of scale for all these plants. So I use a little gray and carefully pick out its trunk and branches. Just a little detail here will add context to the entire riverbank. For these rocks, I add a little of the cadmium red light that I was going to use for the lights. I'm not too worried about the final color at this point because I know I have to come in later with a couple of glazing layers to knock down the brightness of the reds and browns. Next, I use that same color to start shaping all of the old mill buildings, which are deep red with distinctive white trim. Again, there's a lot of detail in the photo that I'm just going to ignore. The important thing is to block out large areas of light and shadow to make the overall shapes of the structures convincing. A lot of times, I'll leave the edges of things unfinished, since I know I have to come back to them, like the sky here. I wasn't exactly sure where I wanted the tree line of Pilot Butte to end as I was painting the sky, so I put it off until now and clean it up as I solidify these roof lines. A few more touch-ups here and there and the riverbank is done. Now I just have to let it dry for a day or so, then I'll come back and paint in the reflections and the lights. For this painstaking detail work, it's time to break out a new brush. I buy my double-aught brushes from Amazon in bulk. These are a great brand, very sturdy. They last a long time, especially for the price, which is something ridiculous, like 50 cents each. New brush in hand, I mix some cad yellow and red and just dive in and start painting. I no longer have the underpainting to use as a guide, so I sort of wing it, looking carefully at the photo to make sure I'm placing the reflections in the correct places. Very quickly I decide to jump up the riverbank and start painting in the lights, because their placement is more important to the composition, and the reflections placement obviously depends on where I put the lights. For the reflections, I start by defining the overall shape with my chrome yellow, which is the lightest yellow I have. Notice that I don't mix it with white, basically brush it on, almost raw out of the tube. To blend it into the water, I use a mix of cad yellow and red, which creates this brilliant orange. It's here where the decision to not work wet in wet really pays off. Mixing this orange with wet blue would have resulted in a really muddy brown color and a range of dark greens. I prefer these bright oranges and yellows. Once the highlights are all in, I decide I need to knock back the background a little bit to make the lights really stand out. To do this, I apply a glaze to darken the background layers of paint. Glazing is a technique where you use a transparent color mixed with terps and a lot of medium to apply a thin layer of paint to cover another. In this case, I use phthalo blue, which is very transparent. Working with a light touch, I go over the entire background. Plants, trees, buildings, rocks, the butte, everything, and apply this thin blue glaze. It's not strong enough to erase the colors beneath, but it unifies and darkens everything, making the old mill lights really pop. Next, I tackle the clumps of reeds that will frame the bottom of the painting. Though I'm sure there's easier ways to paint these, I use a technique I learned from Carl Barks, that famous Disney artist I mentioned in episode 1. He used a bent blade technique where basically he painted every blade of grass individually. Achieving these long, thin lines takes practice and a sure brushstroke. I mix the paint with a lot of terps so that it has almost the consistency of watercolor. Then load up the brush with paint and just start at the top of the reed and pull down. As you're painting, you want to make each reed different, changing up their length, slant, and thickness. It's super important to get tight, firm strokes at the top of each one, because the tops are the most visible, and it's going to be very hard to fix them later if you muddy them up. Toward the bottom of each clump, it doesn't matter as much, because I'm going to come in and mush them all together anyway, creating that thick matting effect you see along riverbanks. Once the dark layer sets up a bit, which only takes an hour or two, I come in with a lighter green and flesh out the foreground. By the time I'm done here, I have a fairly convincing clump of reeds lining my river. The last major task here is the sky. I decided early on that I couldn't follow the photo here because, well, it was kind of boring. I really like the reflections of the lights in the water, but the empty sky, not so much. But I don't want to do a flashy cloudscape or anything too dramatic because that would detract from the reflections. So I opt for something that will enhance the painting's theme, old mill lights, by making it dusk where the stars are just starting to come out. I start by adding this very subtle glow to the horizon. This is still the same mix of colors I've been using, cad yellow and red, but now I'm using them more like a glaze. I don't want an overpowering horizon here, just enough glow to suggest that the sun is setting somewhere behind us. Then I paint in the star field. Again, I don't want anything too flashy or dramatic, so I keep it simple. The key is to mix your white with medium, about 50-50, and use a new double-aught brush that still holds its shape well. Just dip the tip of your brush into the white mixture, paint a couple of stars, then get more paint. If you try to paint too many stars without loading up on paint again, your stars will start to get a little fuzzy. I use that same technique and that same white, very sparingly, to add hot spots to the lights and reflections. Once all that is done, I apply a final layer of glaze, this time using Payne's Gray, which is another oily, transparent color. My goal here is to enhance the lights by darkening the shadow areas of the water, trees, and buildings. Now that the painting is close to being finished, I decide to add a bit of color. Using the same palette of cobalt blue and cad red, I mix the colors with Portland gray to knock them down a bit and paint a few of these flags. I also use the cad red to add just the hint of a neon sign and a bit of red reflection to the water. These splashes of red provide an accent to the yellows and oranges. Then I jump up to the sky and add a little chrome yellow. Again, I don't want to overpower everything else, but just add a little more luminosity. And then back down to the river for one more important detail. The ducks who are making these wakes that run across the water surface. I paint them very simply with a bit of Payne's Gray for their heads and necks and Portland Gray for their bodies. The last thing I add is my signature. I choose a color that complements the painting without being too bright. I want patrons to be able to see my name, but I don't want it to be the first thing they see. And finally, the painting is done. This one was an adventure because halfway through it, I changed my mind about how I was going to try to do it. Not something I recommend. But it's challenges like these that keep the process of painting interesting. Alright, that's it for this episode. If you'd like to see more in this series, consider subscribing to my channel. And please leave a note down in the comments section. I'm always happy to hear from everyone. Thanks for watching.